In the late winter of 2023, 52-year-old Jacob Malloy stretched out in bed. He'd woken up late and was enjoying a lazy Sunday, petting his cat Gizmo, who was splayed out next to him on the bed. Finally, Jacob's stomach started to grumble, so he rolled out of bed and pulled back his curtains. A bright beam of sunshine filled his bedroom with light. He cracked open his window just enough to feel a cool but pleasant breeze sweep through his room. Jacob lived in Orlando, Florida, so even though it was February, it was a mild 60 degrees outside. Jacob heard the coffee maker percolating downstairs, and he knew that it was time to go join his wife Jessica for breakfast. So he went down to the kitchen and quickly invited Jessica to sit at the table while he made them both food. 30 minutes later, Jacob had bacon frying in a cast iron skillet on the stove while he poured pancake batter onto a searing hot griddle. After a minute, he flipped the pancakes, then he turned back to the stove to take the bacon out of the skillet. He timed it just right. The bacon was still soft and flopped gently onto his plate. He hated when bacon got too crispy. It tasted too dry. He used the grease from the bacon to fry up some hash browns and eggs, then carried 2 loaded plates over to the table. Jessica brought over the pot of coffee and then thanked her husband for the extravagant breakfast. Jacob winked and told Jessica not to tell his doctor. She laughed, but Jacob actually wasn't kidding. He was overweight and had type 2 diabetes, and so his doctor had told him a few times to lay off the greasy food. But Jacob figured what the doctor didn't know wouldn't hurt him. He dipped a forkful of hash browns into the golden yolk from his fried eggs and took a big, satisfying bite. A few weeks later, Jacob was out in the yard mowing the lawn when a sharp pain erupted in his temple. Jacob stopped the mower and beelined for the garage. He got migraines about once a month, so he knew what it felt like when one was coming on. Jacob called out to Jessica as he walked in through the garage door and jogged up the stairs. He got some headache medicine out of his nightstand and took 2 pills before collapsing onto his bed. Within a few minutes, a familiar ache began to pulse behind his temples. But instead of moving forward towards his forehead like usual, the pain seemed to migrate toward the back of his skull. And his migraine medication wasn't helping at all, which was unusual. It was strong stuff, and until now, it always seemed to do the trick. And so Jacob had no choice but to just bury his head in a pillow and ride out the pain. Finally, sometime that evening, the throbbing at the base of his skull subsided. It had been a shorter migraine, but so painful it didn't feel like he'd gotten off easy. 4 months later, Jacob sat in his primary care doctor's office, chatting with his physician while a nurse took his blood pressure. She frowned when she read the numbers aloud on the blood pressure sleeve. Jacob's doctor admitted they were a little high, but otherwise his vitals did seem fine. Jacob nodded. He expected a little bit of high blood pressure, given all the greasy food he'd been eating. But it was not high blood pressure that had brought Jacob to the doctors that morning. It was his migraines. Ever since that day he was out mowing his lawn, they'd become more and more frequent. Weekly instead of monthly. And they were really beginning to interfere with his life. Most recently, he'd been spending just about every weekend laid up in bed. The doctor found this very concerning, and he asked if Jacob was experiencing any other symptoms, like seizures or numbness or sensations he couldn't explain. Jacob thought for a moment, but then said no, everything else felt normal. The doctor nodded and told Jacob that he wanted to order a CT scan. If there was something going on in Jacob's brain, the CT scan would show it. An hour later, Jacob and the doctor looked at the CT scan image of Jacob's brain on a computer screen. The doctor pointed to small circular areas in the middle of the scan, and he said that they looked like cysts within the white matter of Jacob's brain. Cysts are tiny fluid-filled sacs. The doctor said cysts in the brain are never good news because they can cause a painful pressure buildup and even vision problems. The doctor explained that his biggest concern amongst the cysts was the cluster of cysts located at the bottom right-hand corner of Jacob's brain. He thought that those could actually be causing Jacob's symptoms, the headaches. Jacob reflexively moved a hand and touched the base of his skull. He told the doctor that actually, now that he thought about it, there had been one change in his migraines besides their frequency. Instead of throbbing right above his eyes the way they normally did, the pain had sort of moved to the back of his skull, to right where that cluster of cysts was located on the CT scan. The doctor told Jacob he was admitting him to the hospital immediately. He suspected that Jacob might have a rare condition called congenital neurological cysts, meaning that these cysts have been present in his head for his entire life. But now they could be growing and pressing against Jacob's brain, causing these intense headaches. If more tests showed that was the case, Jacob would need brain surgery to remove the cysts and stop the pressure. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. The thought of brain surgery terrified him. He asked if he could have a few minutes to call his wife and have her come down to the hospital. Later that afternoon, Jacob sat upright in a hospital bed, with Jessica sitting beside him in a chair. A neurologist stood at the foot of the bed, holding a new scan of Jacob's brain on his tablet. He explained that the location and distribution of the cysts in Jacob's brain were unusual. In his opinion, Jacob did not have congenital neurological cysts. Jacob perked up and asked if that meant he didn't need brain surgery. But the doctor said he wasn't sure yet. There was definitely still something in Jacob's brain that shouldn't have been there. Then he began asking Jacob questions about his travel history, whether he'd ever visited a farm and what his house and living conditions were like. Jacob felt mildly confused, but answered the doctor's questions as best as he could. Neither he nor Jessica traveled very much. The last time they left home was 2 years ago when they'd taken a cruise from Miami to the Bahamas, and he'd never been on a farm. The closest he got to animals was petting his cat, Gizmo. The neurologist asked Jacob to walk him through a normal day in his life, including everything he liked to eat at mealtimes. Jacob was a bit embarrassed, but he admitted to the lavish breakfast that he liked to make on the weekends. Jacob had barely started talking when the neurologist stopped him and told Jacob he'd be right back. Then he hurried out of the room. Jacob was a bit surprised, but it seemed like the doctor had a new idea, and soon enough, the neurologist was back. He informed Jacob that he was ordering a full workup to test for infectious diseases. Jacob nodded, feeling as curious as he was frightened. But the next day, the neurologist gave Jacob a diagnosis that he couldn't have imagined in his wildest dreams. The neurologist confirmed that Jacob did not have brain cysts, and Jacob felt instantly relieved by that. But the neurologist told Jacob to brace himself for the rest of the diagnosis. His migraines were being caused by foreign organisms that had somehow gotten into his brain. The round things that the doctor saw in his brain scan were living creatures, tapeworms to be precise. And the neurologist said they got there because of the fancy breakfasts that Jacob loved so much. Specifically, it had to do with the bacon. Jacob didn't like crispy bacon. He liked soft, chewy bacon, something he told the doctor. But that indicated that the bacon was undercooked. And so the theory was, at some point, some of that undercooked bacon must have been infected with tapeworm larvae, and then those larvae were not killed in the frying pan. Had it been cooked long enough, they would have been. But even so, the neurologist explained that the tapeworms would never have reached Jacob's brain if not for a second problem. The neurologist said that the tapeworm can only infect the brain when someone touches the feces that contain the tapeworm larva. The neurologist suspected that after Jacob ate the tapeworm larva from the undercooked bacon and then had a bowel movement containing the tapeworm larva, he must not have washed his hands properly and then touched his nose or mouth. After that, the larva made its way to Jacob's brain. Thankfully, the problem was treatable. The neurologist put Jacob on a 2-week regimen of antiparasitic and anti-inflammatory medications, which killed the tapeworms in his brain. Once the tapeworms were gone, his migraines improved. And so ultimately, Jacob learned a painful lesson in proper hygiene.